And hello and welcome everyone to today's discussion. Before we get started, I really wanted to address why we at Liberty were interested in holding or hosting this discussion. At Liberty, we get to see firsthand how climate change is really impacting our policyholders. As of July of this year, US has already experienced 8 major climate disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion each. And this does not even cover the immeasurable damage that that it has done for communities and lives of individuals. And so today, I'm hoping that with this discussion, it helps us taking action and towards more mitigation. And what we're hoping is to explore topics such as why resiliency matters to insurance companies, as well as how can it help our communities. What are some public stakeholders, such as governments and associations, doing about climate resiliency? And finally, exploring some of the resources that are available to build for the future, with a special focus on understanding the policy and legislative efforts underway. So with that, I'm really going to kick off the conversation. Kelly, let's start with you. Help us set the stage. Talk to me a bit more about your role at Liberty and what your team is seeing with related to impacts of climate change on the build environment.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So my team works in catastrophe modeling, research, and development. So really our role is to take apart catastrophe models, which are the tools that the insurance and reinsurance industry uses to essentially assess our biggest, meanest, ugliest disasters, whether they're natural or otherwise. So as you might imagine, that means that a significant part of our work is involved with evaluating the impact of climate to develop forward-looking views of physical hazard. So obviously climate affects really an enormous variety of different hazards. And so how do you prioritize where to focus your attention and where to start? Well, how do you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So in my team, we really focus on the types of hazards that are going to have clear and immediate impacts in both the current and very near future climate, because that's at the time scale where insurers have tools that are readily available to allow us to assess our near-term risk and are actually actionable within our business and actionable for our clients. So for us, that means primarily focusing on hurricane, water-related perils like flood and wildfire. So on the hurricane side, we do a lot of work assessing the impacts of hurricane frequency and intensity, particularly for the most intense storms, because we expect that very intense storms, like we just saw with Hurricane Ida, will potentially be increasing in frequency in the future. The other really low-hanging fruit for climate-related impacts on hurricanes is coming from storm surge, because it turns out that while the storm surges themselves from hurricanes probably aren't changing all that much, they sit on top of a platform of higher sea level. So every single storm surge is a little bit higher and reaches a little bit further inland because it's sitting on top of higher mean sea levels. This also has impacts on flood risk, both coastal flood, so what we think of as sunny day or nuisance flooding, which can impact communities on sort of a broad scale over sort of near and medium term timeframes, as well as things like flash flood, where you have an interaction between an increase in extreme rainfall and that interacts with our built environment, because you get increases in rainfall coming in, and then as you pave over your cities, there is nowhere for that rainfall to go. So those compound and you can get very extreme flash floods like what we saw in the Northeast. The last one that we look at is primarily wildfire, which is a particularly tough nut to crack. We're seeing increases in hazard tied with wildfire that are primarily driven by increases in temperature. So increases in temperature are one of our clearest climate-related impacts. So that is a pretty nice bright line that we can tie to wildfire. The problem is that while you see very large increases in burn area related to temperature, it's hard to tie that with actual changes in damage. And so you have to really focus in on wind-driven events, things like Santa Ana-driven, where we've had several of our largest wildfires in history within the last couple of years. So we take apart these hazards and look at them in our near-term timeframe, because we don't want to be assessing climate risk out in 2100, because while you can look at it out at that timeframe, that doesn't actually help us with making decisions. And we want to make sure that we can then take that risk and make sure that our business units and our clients and our partners can understand that risk for themselves. For example, if we have clients who are sitting at 3 feet above sea level, we want to make sure that they understand that that doesn't mean, well, I don't have to worry about flood risk until 2100, because they will experience that change in risk in terms of changes in coastal flood frequency long before their front door is underwater in 2100. So we really see insurance as having a key role as climate translation. So understanding this rapidly evolving climate science literature and translating those into the impacts and how we expect that they will be felt on the ground. So as we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida and many related disasters here through this year and recent years, we're really dealing with a massive amount of increase in extreme hazards today. So we need building codes and infrastructure that is not designed for the weather of the past, but the weather of the future, and we need it now. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Angela, can you elaborate on the agency's perspective of evolving impacts of climate on our communities?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you today and talk a little bit about what we are seeing in FEMA as it relates to climate change. And I can say as emergency managers, we have seen the impacts of climate change directly. I've personally been with FEMA for 22 years, and just over that period of time, you can see the changes that are being felt throughout the country. Increased precipitation, wildfires, heat events, sea level rise have all caused monumental problems nationwide. The extreme drought in the western part of the nation, ensuing fire season continue to grow and get worse. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, we suffered the worst hurricane season in history last year, with over 30 named storms. Hurricane Ida recently exceeded our expectations, impacting Louisiana significantly, as well as many other parts of the country and the Northeast. So one side of our country is burning, the other side has too much water. An issue we were just talking about a few minutes ago was the rapid intensification of Hurricane Ida and the impacts that has on things like evacuations of our communities, and how that's changing the needs for our first responders. Some communities are facing new risks that they've never faced before, such as wildfire or drought. And so they need to be able to quickly learn mitigation and resilience strategies from others who have experienced them in the past. And some communities are facing an increase in severity, such as tremendous amounts of rainfall in a short period of time that are taxing their already strained infrastructure. And more communities are facing another event before they've fully recovered from the previous. And we know that those impacts are not felt equally. Some people are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, and they need our assistance the most. So these issues are demanding that we, and by we, I mean all of us, take some new approaches to mitigation and resilience. We know we need to increase our investment in mitigation and resilience. That is a given. But fundamentally, it also means we need to build the consideration of risk, resilience, adaptation strategies into all of our planning and investment decisions across both the public and the private sector. Through inclusive planning processes, we can work collaboratively to develop and implement risk reduction strategies that focus on our most significant problems and risks. And we're finding that the problems are really complex, and they require coordinated and community-wide solutions, which tap into multiple sources of funding, programs, financial tools, and technical assistance. And this approach is at the heart of our national mitigation investment strategy. Back in 2019, we developed this strategy. It was developed by the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, an interagency body that works on mitigation policy, led by FEMA. And it was developed to be a single national strategy for the whole community to effectively and efficiently advance the practice of mitigation investment in the United States. to increase the nation's resilience to natural hazards and ultimately build a culture of preparedness. Because we know that effective mitigation investments can save lives and money. The uptake in natural hazards has led us to reevaluate our hazard mitigation grant programs. We have aligned all of our grant programs through a strategic framework based on this national mitigation investment strategy. And this gives us a North Star for us to increase community resilience and protect human life and property, with climate considerations and equity both in mind. This guides our efforts to build a more resilient nation, and we've built in equity and incorporating future conditions such as changes in land use, climate, and communities all into our work. And it also reflects our focus on community resilience. We recognize and want to support the needs for communities to consider a system-wide approach to mitigation, which is a resilient strategy that mitigates the risk to critical sectors of a community and builds community-wide resilience to natural hazards. And if you've heard our administrator speak, it's a term that she uses quite a bit as she talks about system-based mitigation. So again, implementing this national mitigation investment strategy is not a federal-only task. In order to address these problems before us, we need everyone, citizens, communities, states, tribes, private sector, federal government, to work together to do everything they can to reduce disaster suffering. And that's why the system-based mitigation is an important key in finding ways to link, leverage, and align what we're already doing to meet these goals. Also, focusing on infrastructure has been good for the country. The resilience efforts post-Katrina in Louisiana, for example, proved beneficial to hundreds of thousands. Not only the Army Corps flood walls on their levee systems as an important structural infrastructure, but also all of the other collective mitigation efforts that took place to address transportation, housing, and other critical issues in the impacted area. So our hazard mitigation assistance programs are focused on improving Lifeline's infrastructure. Again, another example from Louisiana is Ida did a number on communication lines, cutting millions off from electricity. Many will be without power, some for potentially a month or longer. And this emphasizes the very essence of what our grant programs are designed to do. They're meant to protect populations from the impacts of future conditions. And FEMA has a very long history of funding projects meant to help communities become more resilient to climate change. Our hazard mitigation grant program has funded numerous community projects across the country. We have a mitigation action portfolio, which talks about many of our innovative projects, ranging from microgrids to stormwater containment to more simple projects like generators, all efforts to make communities more resilient to future storm activity. And we'll talk a little bit more about our BRIC program, but that also allows us to bolster our effort to battle climate change and prioritizes activities that mitigate the risk to one or more community lifelines, such as hospitals, roads, communication systems, among others. One thing that you'll hear us talk about, and again, I know we're going to be focused on BRIC later today, is that all of our HMA assistance programs play a role in helping communities see the benefits of accomplishing mitigation and also of adopting the best building codes and standards. We do see building code adoption as a very high value mitigation measure for all communities. And in fact, as part of the effort to reform federal disaster programs and build the nation's capacity to better mitigate the impacts of catastrophic events, the BRIC program prioritizes and incentivizes the adoption and enforcement of building codes. So thank you. I'll turn things back over to you and we can talk more about the BRIC program a little later.
Thanks, Angela. So Kelly, I'm going to bring you back in here. So it's clear that climate change and its impacts are part of our future. From an insurance company perspective, can you talk a bit about the role resilient buildings play in mitigating climate risk?
You know, it's interesting. we tend to think of climate risk as being a future problem, something that we're going to have to deal with down the line. But I think we're, as we're hearing, it's very clear that this is already happening now. And we really are going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to work on reducing emissions and pair that with building in climate adaptation, because there's a certain amount of climate risk that is baked in today that we are going to have to adapt to and live with as a society. So from an insurance perspective, we want to make sure that we are developing forward-looking views of risk, but also that we are figuring out ways to mitigate the risk that is already coming. Because we don't want to just say, we're just going to try and be chasing after an increase in hazard forever. Right now, we don't experience things like hurricanes in the same way that we would in the past. So our tools that we actually use can take account of things like increases and improvements in building codes. So for example, one of the most disastrous hurricanes in history was the Great Miami Hurricane, which, as you might imagine, Miami looked very different in the 1920s when it hit as opposed to when it hits today. So we can't just think that we will see increases in loss as we have more people moving to the coasts, more people moving to areas of high hazard. There was a recent report arguing that 1 in 3 Americans have experienced a climate-related disaster this year. So with that all in mind, we now have tools that can account for how we are improving our building stock for the disasters that we're living with now. This is where insurers really have an opportunity to step to the plate, because they can say, we can actually quantify and tell you how much it helps to improve your building codes. And we have seen over and over again that the money that's invested in building resiliently pays dividends for years and decades down the line in reduced disaster costs. So that benefits our clients, it benefits our consumers, it benefits our communities, and it benefits us, right? That is as close as you can get to a win-win situation in climate adaptation, is putting in the investments now to building codes and to infrastructures, because otherwise we are going to be paying for it later, and it's going to cost a lot more in both money as well as lives and impacts to communities.
Thanks for that. Aaron, we've heard a lot about the need for resilient buildings. What provisions are there in the bipartisan Senate infrastructure legislation that will help our communities increase their resilience capabilities?
Thanks, Rakhi. And thank you for the invitation to participate today. So in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I think the most significant provision related to FEMA and its hazard mitigation assistance programs. Well, there are two in particular. There's $3.5 billion for the flood mitigation assistance program, which I believe will be probably one of the largest historical infusions of cash into FMA ever. There's additionally $500 million to seed a new state revolving loan fund program focused on hazard mitigation projects that the Congress enacted at the end of the 116th Congress. There's also a significant infusion of funds for high hazard potential dam rehabilitation programs to a magnitude that would take decades to achieve in, via regular appropriations process. So I think from that perspective, in the bipartisan deal, in the FEMA space related to mitigation, I think there's some frustration with opportunities that we may have missed in the bipartisan deal to ensure that we are codifying the need across all of the investments that are being made to build better, to build stronger. And that's something that we are looking to address in the reconciliation package to the degree that we can. The House carried language in Chairman DeFazio's Invest Act earlier this year and last year that would have ensured all DOT investments across the nation were built to a higher standard. That's something that we're looking to do in the reconciliation package as well. We're also looking at some additional funds for the state revolving loan fund grants in the reconciliation package, as well as a dedicated stream of funding to FEMA for building code adoption, enforcement, and implementation grant program. I think that's, as Angela mentioned, paramount, is ensuring that communities are building to the latest codes and standards. That has been demonstrated to provide the greatest return on investment when it comes to federal mitigation investments. And that is something that we're committed to putting some additional resources in.
Thanks, Aaron. Pam, you've been very patient. Let's bring you into the conversation. We know BuildStrong has been very active in this area, and we're members of BuildStrong. And the Senate proposal is only part of this conversation, but can you share with us what your coalition is working on with regards to legislation that will be introduced in the House? And how is resilient building part of these conversations?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for hosting this really important conversation that is so very timely. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the tremendous partnerships and efforts that are being undertaken by both FEMA and our policy leadership in the House and the Senate. Aaron and the members that he works for have been tremendous partners in a very bipartisan way, so that we can continue to build on what happened in 2018 in the wake of what we thought then were the historic storms of 2017. And so we're building on the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that did really change the way this country started thinking about investing in disaster resilience before a disaster. And I'm so excited that we are going to talk about FEMA's BRIC program that they stood up in the wake of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and how that has really started to transform not only the conversation, as Angie said, about systemic investment in resilience, but truly in the way that we are thinking about how we target communities. And this is the conversation that the insurance industry, as Kelly said, is so critical. Communicating risk to individuals, to communities, to businesses, to organizations, to regions, and ultimately the country. Because historically, as a country, we've done a pretty lousy job at adequately communicating the true risk that people face. So in partnership with these great folks, the BuildStrong Coalition is working in a very bipartisan way, because these are not partisan issues. Disasters don't only hit red or blue states, but truly to drive more resources to mitigation. And in this historic time when we have seen efforts to put more resources on the table than ever before, truly to build capacity and capability at that local level to identify risk and to identify risk-reducing, cost-effective. We've already talked a lot about that return on investment. I'm going to throw the data out there. The National Institute of Building Sciences say for building codes, we get an 11-to-1 return. I don't know about you guys, but there aren't many things that I'm investing in where I see that kind of return on investment. And we're not only talking about a return and the good use of taxpayer dollars. Ultimately, we are talking about saving lives, livelihoods, property, and ultimately the economic vitality of our communities. So we are working to drive more resources to FEMA's programs specifically directed at pre-disaster mitigation and ultimately the BRIC program. And again, these are going to be resources that are more evergreen, that we don't have to fight year after year for appropriations. And in this country, what have we seen? We only kind of pay attention to this in the wake of a catastrophic disaster. So how do we keep that flow, those investments, that focus evergreen, so that we aren't doing this ebb and flow only in the wake of catastrophic disaster years, and that we're constantly thinking about how we can draw down risks in our communities? Also, as we've already mentioned, the importance of building codes. And while FEMA has very much done things for actually years to get people focused on the importance of building codes, we really need to provide resources to allow communities to walk that walk. How do they identify that they are a community that needs to strengthen their building codes? How do they work with local elected officials, your community, your stakeholders, to bring those building codes online? And then the very important piece, how do we enforce those? So FEMA is taking a very kind of bifurcated look at this in the sense like, how do we drive building codes in the wake of a disaster so that we're rebuilding well, smart, better, but also how do we line communities up so that they're prepared when the unthinkable happens? Because it's not a question of if, it is a question of when. And finally, the key piece to what we are dubbing the Resilient America Act is focusing on residential resilience. Not only do we need a systemic investment in things like key lifeline infrastructure, but we really need to help address the existing housing stock in this country. There's a tremendous number of buildings and homes that are out of code, aren't built to the highest codes and standards. And guess what? Our friends at the Institute for Building and Home Safety have shown us there are key retrofits that homeowners can invest in and that we as organizations and government can help individuals invest in that strengthen their home and let them survive the next disaster. And that's everything from roof tie downs to roof deck ceilings to cripple wall stabilization in earthquake scenarios. And we're learning more and more every day, particularly in the wildfire scenario. What can we do to give homeowners the tools to protect themselves and ultimately to be a key piece to the protection of their communities? So I'm very excited that we've had so much excitement and enthusiasm and support from our stakeholders, and hopefully we'll continue to drive policymakers in this country to set up the right federal framework so that we can build a strong nation.
Thanks, Pam. I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please do feel free to put it into the chat box. We will get to them at the end of the session. So continuing the conversation, Angela, let's get back to you. Can you provide an introduction to the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities or BRIC program? And what are some of the projects that were approved under BRIC funding so that people get an idea as to what they can come to you for?
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk about the BRIC program, and just to build off of what both Aaron and Pam said, it truly is a really exciting time to work in the space of mitigation and resilience, because it really, again, despite the challenges that we frame that are out there, we just have this amazing opportunity to really be able to invest in a more resilient nation and reduce disaster suffering and future disaster costs. And having a pre-disaster program and an investment in that program that can be utilized to catalyze that investment really is a significant opportunity. So just to share with you, for the first year of the program, which was in 2020, we had $500 million in the BRIC program. The president in late spring announced that the program was going to be at the $1 billion level for 2021, which I just have to share is one part of almost $5 billion in mitigation funding that was announced to be available this summer. $1 billion in BRIC, $160 million in the flood mitigation assistance program, which Aaron mentioned, and then a historic announcement of $3.46 billion in the hazard mitigation grant program for COVID, which is available to 59 states and territories. So BRIC is one piece of that larger mitigation puzzle. So the BRIC program, again, was launched in 2020, funds innovative projects, many of which align with community lifelines. So community leaders in energy, communication, transportation, health and human services, all can really think about projects that will protect critical infrastructure for communities and cities. For example, energy resilience has that cascading effect on building resilience in communities, particularly for those that are smaller and in more rural areas. BRIC, we see as very much a capability and capacity building program as well. So it encourages that capability and capacity building to mitigate risks from natural hazards by cultivating shared responsibility for investing in mitigation, encouraging that culture of resilience, building local and state and tribal capacity, and developing the partnerships across the public and private sector that are absolutely critical for long-term success. It also recognizes the growing hazards associated with climate change and the need for mitigation activities that promote resilience and adaptation with respect to those hazards. In our inaugural year, FEMA selected 22 projects under the national competition that scored the highest based on the 200-point competition criteria. Of the 22 projects selected, 18 of them included nature-based solutions. Many of the projects are located in coastal states, which are most at risk from sea level rise and other climate-related changes. And inland, FEMA selected numerous projects that focus on fixing infrastructure to improve community resilience from system breakdown or service disruption, which will benefit hundreds of thousands of people. So I want to give you just a few examples of some of the 2020 project selections for the BRIC programs. In Southeast Washington, D.C., a project to reduce stormwater overflow and leverage green spaces will prevent sewer overflow, stop closures of roads that provide access to hospitals and for emergency vehicles, and provide new parks and green space for residents. In Sonoma County, California, a new resilience project creates buffers to wildfire, decreases spread of wildfire, improves forest health, and encourages residents to create their own defenses to prevent the cascading effects of wildfire. And I don't know if you recently saw this, but they were talking about what saved Tahoe just in the past week. And they were talking about how critical the individual mitigation efforts were in people's homes to actually saving Tahoe from the wildfire. In several parts of the country, leveraging infrastructure and nature-based solutions like revetments, live shorelines, green space, and other methodologies has the combined effect of preventing damage to critical infrastructure, improving the environment, creating green space, and other benefits like improved drinking water quality, sewage flow reduction, and many other human health benefits. We're really encouraged by the project selections that occurred this year. A couple things that are really important for you to know as you think about applying to the BRIC program in the future. One is the notice of funding opportunities, again, are out there. You can start applying as of October 1st, and that runs through the end of, that application period runs through the end of January. We do have a set of both technical and qualitative criteria that really, again, form the basis of that 200-point selection process. And so it's really important for you to become familiar with that. We have a whole webinar series that we've been rolling out, started this summer through the end of this month. Those are all available to you on our website, so that break down the specific criteria for the program and help walk you through them. It's really important if you're developing an application just to become familiar with those criteria and what they mean so that you can be best positioned for success if you're going to apply for the program. The other thing just to share is BRIC is one of two programs this year, along with our flood mitigation assistance program, that is a pilot under the administration's Justice 40 initiative. And so if you're not familiar with Justice 40, it was created by the Executive Order on the Climate Crisis. And its goal is to be able to ensure that our programs are targeting 40% of the benefits of our programs to disadvantaged communities. And so we will be serving, BRIC will be a pilot in that program, and you will see in both things like the direct technical assistance that we are making available, as well as on our criteria that we have made some revisions to that criteria this year to address the needs of disadvantaged communities. So with that, I will pause there and can answer anything else in follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see a lot of questions are coming in fast and furious, but Aaron and Pam, many of attendees here are from states and local communities. Can you share some of the observations and lessons learned from the first year? And do you have any advice for accessing these resources that Angela has just mentioned?
Sure. So I think from a congressional perspective, there has been some frustration expressed to us on the part of members who represent areas that were not selected as part of the initial BRIC funding round, and the geographic disparities. There is we have heard that there's a lot of concern about the focus on coastal areas and not so much on inland riverine vulnerable communities. That said, we are hopeful that future years will provide more geographic diversity in the program selections. And we're also looking at ways to further boost that dedicated stream of funding to the BRIC program so that, as Pam and Angela already mentioned, it's not reliant upon a standalone appropriation, and looking to boost that 6% set aside that currently exists to something greater. We are doing that, as Pam said, in a bipartisan way in the forthcoming Resilient America bill. I think the other frustration that we've seen is that despite these resources, there are still some states that have, or a state that has failed to take advantage of this incredible new resource. And we've had some conversations with Angela and the team at FEMA about how to engage with all states, tribes, territories, and local governments to ensure that they are fully aware of the incredible resources that are out there across the HMA programs, including BRIC, as well as the technical assistance that exists for those smaller and more vulnerable communities. We held a hearing in July of last year, looking at the experience of underserved and vulnerable populations during and after disaster. And that is something that we're also looking at developing we have some legislation in draft form, bipartisan legislation that will hopefully be bicameral as well, that would provide some more direction to FEMA to prioritize mitigation resources based on its own National Risk Index, which was released in November of last year, detailing sort of the highest risk areas across the country that are vulnerable to 18 natural hazards. So that is something that Congress is paying attention to, and we look forward to providing additional resources to FEMA so that we can get those resources out into these communities as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Pam.
Yeah, to add to that, I'm gonna take away some of Angie's thunder. So let's talk about what FEMA saw in 2020, the inaugural year of the BRIC grant program. So in a year, 2020, you might say that our state and local governments were historically taxed, had very little bandwidth for new requirements, new applications, efforts focused on disaster mitigation. And guess what? FEMA saw over 990 applications to mitigate over 1,500 structures. That would have been a total application cost of over $5.5 billion for a grant program that in its inaugural year had 500 million. So that is pretty darn exciting. And if we were looking for evidence that this is a need, this is a priority in our local governments, here it is. And that's why we're so glad that policymakers are continuing to drive more resources to these sorts of investments. And again, on FEMA's part, they aren't stovepiping all programs into just one set of funding. They are looking to be creative and across the resources that are available, not only from FEMA, but other federal agencies, to direct those applications to the right source of funding. So when there are creative solutions that can only be met through something like BRIC funding, that's where that money is targeted. And so I would say that probably the most notable thing in 2020 that we saw FEMA focusing on was certainly that capacity building. We see a lot of focus on on planning and prioritization, because we do, as a nation, we really do need to bring that capability back into priority for our local governments. FEMA is doing a tremendous job with these technical assistance teams that they're expanding in 2021, again, to both get at the equity piece, but to help these communities on the ground that are facing the greatest risk find the best solutions. And then I would probably say that one of the most exciting things that we are seeing, and this is really, again, where the insurance sector can absolutely come to bear, is creative partnerships. Get to the table. FEMA is fostering now the efforts of multiple lines of funding, multiple parties, both public and private sector, that can come together to invest in that systemic solution. So insurance sector needs to get to the table, start providing the conversations about risk and the data that you're seeing. And guess what? You guys are plugged into better creative solutions than most local officials have even heard about. I am still encountering local governments that are like, wait, there are federal resources out there. Wait, there are industries that want to help us solve this problem. Yes, so get to the table, because again, as we've seen, insurance companies can absolutely help communities adopt building codes, start that conversation in local communities. The insurance sector has such a tremendous network of those intimate local relationships with individuals, with communities, and with regions that really the federal government just can't transplant in any way, shape, or form. So I'm excited to see, by FEMA fostering these creative relationships, what we're truly able to do to leverage this federal money as truly seed money, and with private investment, nonprofit investment, individual investment layered on top of it, how we're really going to be able to transform the country.
Thanks, Pam.
Rakhi, if I could just build on one thing that Pam mentioned. I think one of the things that has hampered congressional efforts in the past has been sort of the stovepiping of jurisdictions and a committee's ability to only work on programs within its purview. And I'd say that in the wake of 2017 and 2018 disaster seasons and everything that we've endured since, there is much more communication between committees that have jurisdiction over complementary federal disaster and mitigation programs to ensure that they are operating in concert or working to operate in better concert moving forward. So that means conversations between the Transportation Committee and the Financial Services Committee, which has oversight over not only the flood mitigation assistance program at FEMA, but also HUD's CDBG DR program and community disaster block grant mitigation program at HUD, working as well with our counterparts on the Ways and Means Committee to see if there are investment vehicles that can help drive that needed private investment in bonds and communities that could fund resilience and mitigation projects. So these are all conversations that are happening on the legislative side as well to ensure that FEMA and these communities have all of the tools that they're available at their fingertips to constructively finance these necessary investments.
Thanks, Aaron. So Pam, first question goes to you. You mentioned that we need to help community leaders understand that they may need to strengthen building codes. Since we have some of those people on the call today, can you elaborate on what some of these parameters may be?
Well, first and foremost, let me make clear that we are talking about the standard consensus-based, model building codes, right? Like, we aren't talking about just implementing any building code. We are talking about the latest, greatest modern building codes, because what we've seen from our friends at the ICC is that really they are constantly engaged in that conversation. What are the best techniques? What are the best guidances that we need to give to our communities for creating a stronger, newly built environment? And so that is really, not only does the insurance sector truly bring a level of expertise and knowledge, but experience in this conversation, right? Like, this is where you guys, your business is founded on these concepts. So it really does help in the translation and helping our stakeholders understand that we're not kidding. This is really not only a very important conversation, but it saves money. It saves lives. And we've seen that time and time again. And I do think that the insurance sector is one of the best mouthpieces to help communicate that at an individual and community level. So again, I would say get to the table, help communities understand what we're talking about when we talk about the latest consensus-based codes for the built environment, but also help them understand what resources can be available to help retrofit homes, because we will always have more existing structures in this home than in this country than newly built structures. So how do we protect those that have older structures that weren't built to code? I think, Florida is one of the best examples. When Florida adopted the strongest building codes in the country and started building out of concrete block, a lot of people said, oh, this is going to halt development. Developers, it's going to be cost prohibitive. But what we've seen time and time again is these increased standards do not significantly increase the overall cost of homes or buildings to individuals. And what do we get on the return? An 11-to-1 return on costs avoided to recover, rebuild, bounce back from these disasters that are truly inevitable.
Thanks, Pam. Angela, question. Ramaya asks if you could quickly elaborate on the Sonoma County program that you'd mentioned in your remarks.
I don't have a whole lot of additional information that I can give you right now, but I'm happy to send something out that kind of summarizes the project. I mean, again, it's a wildfire risk reduction project in Sonoma County, California, that really represents a lot of innovation in terms of wildfire mitigation. So I'm happy to send out some more information if you're interested in the follow-up.
Thanks. Kelly, can you share examples of what a resilient building solution would look like for preventing impacts from hurricanes such as Ida, and what can we be asking from our community leaders today to prepare for the future?
Sure. Well, I think it's worth starting off and saying, when you have a 150-mile-an-hour hurricane, you're probably not going to prevent all damage. So let's just set the appropriate baseline there. But I think Ida is a really excellent example that shows the intersection between community scale resilience and individual scale resilience. In Louisiana, in the area where the landfall actually happened, New Orleans had invested something like $14.5 billion in upgrading and rebuilding their levees in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And that looked like a pretty big price tag at the time. That levee probably just paid for itself in one storm. So it doesn't really matter if you're doing everything right on, making sure your roof is nailed down appropriately or whatever, if you're 10 feet underwater because the levee protecting your community failed. So we have to do mitigation together, individuals and communities. That being said, there's also important things that you can do to make sure that your home survives a wind event. So the most important thing to do to protect your home in a wind event is protect the roof, because if you lose the roof, you've probably destroyed the property. So there are a lot, the example of the Florida Building Code is a great example, because the different ages of buildings and the high frequency of hurricanes that you see in Florida means you can actually see the impacts of building codes play out in real time. So in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, which hit the Florida Keys as a Category 4 hurricane before hitting the rest of Florida as a Category 3, you could actually see pictures where there were homes that were next door neighbors to each other, where some older homes that were built with gable roofs, meaning two sides, had completely lost their roofs. The roofs were gone, rain had infiltrated, those homes were probably near total losses. Next door neighbor has a gable roof, meaning four sides, or sorry, a hip roof, meaning four sides. That home maybe lost a few shingles. We can build for extreme events if we include that kind of information in our building codes. We can build for high wind events today if we have the will to do so. Then we saw the exact same impacts play out in the Northeast with the rain impacts of Hurricane Ida. Because again, we need community scale management of extreme rainfall events. It doesn't matter if you've built your home appropriately if your local community doesn't have appropriate stormwater management. And it's really hard to manage stormwater when you're completely paved over and you don't have sort of green spaces that can absorb stormwater as it comes in. So the communities need to be thinking about that, and urban metros are particularly susceptible to that sort of high intensity flash flood type of events. That being said, we also need to make sure that we understand where this flood risk is and how it's changing in the future. So updating and upgrading flood maps so that people who are sitting in potentially high-risk areas know that they are at risk or know that they could be at risk in the future can help them make decisions about investing in their own properties to, say, raise them up or put in other flood waterproofing measures to make sure that they as an individual can protect their homes and their properties against flood events. So IDA is a great example of community scale infrastructure needing to be right along with individual practices, and there are things that we can do on both sides. And we saw that play out in action just a couple of weeks ago.
Thanks, Kelly. Angela, questions are coming in fast and furious for you. So Weston asks if funding can be will be provided for impact assessment oversight of rapid infrastructure development. Is there an effort to develop cumulative effects assessment for infrastructure programs or strategic environment and social assessments at the national level? What role will CEQ or EPA play?
Okay, so let me provide a little bit of just an overall framing. Not sure I'm going to get to be able to answer your specific question, but right now we are looking at how we need to continue to evolve our programs and the types of projects that we are funding in order to be able to support the changing needs of climate change. You know, so looking at, we have very broad eligibility in terms of project types that can be funded. Part of our challenge is making sure that we can help support the benefit cost analysis and those other things that can help us be able to help communities translate that into projects that can be funded. And so that's something that we're working on, not only for BRIC, but across our various programs, because I know there's been some other questions about some eligible project types for us. The one thing in terms of risk assessments, impact assessments, and other things is a lot of that then gets focused in the planning aspects of things. So planning is an eligible funding activity under all of our hazard mitigation assistance programs, and a lot of the data and the assessments needed to assess risk and understand what the impacts are to infrastructure or other lifelines, those kinds of things can be part of that planning piece. And so that's where I would say you'd want to then really work with your planners in your local community in terms of what makes sense in terms of the mitigation plan.
Thanks, Angela. I know you took Stephen's question there too. So Kelly, I want to try slide in one more question before we close. How do we get much better, fully up-to-date and appropriate predictive information on flood and other hazard risks to federal agencies and state, local, tribal, and territorial agencies, as well as public and private sector? Basically, how do we get better data?
Invest in FEMA's NFIP maps. They need to be updated regularly and not once every 30 or 40 years in some places. Make sure they are accounting for climate risk and are not fully backwards looking, and partner with private sector groups that are working on flood modeling today. And they're getting that flood landscape has changed dramatically just in the last 5 years. There are a ton more modeling groups who are trying to tackle this than was the case before. And I think that we can work across the public and private sector to get a more comprehensive view of flood risk going forward into the future.
Thanks, everyone. Before I close, I wanted to see if anyone had any other thoughts that they would like to share. All right, you know, to me, this has been a very interesting conversation. I've learned a lot for sure. I wanted to thank our panelists and really close by highlighting the 3 takeaways that were key, that for me at least. One was how climate change really impacts different communities differently. There is need for communities for more education around the different types of risks. When we talk about climate change, it's not just one type of risk. Different communities can experience hurricanes, storm rise, floods, wildfires, and the mitigation that efforts will be very different for different kinds of these risks. So I think it's important to go dig deeper and understand what climate change means for your community. Second, the one thing that was very clear was that building codes provide the biggest bang for buck, and that Pam, I'm going to take your 11 for 1 return. I'm going to keep repeating that it's the best return that you can get for your money. It's also, but here the challenge is really about focusing not just on the new buildings, but retrofitting the old buildings. And updating codes is one thing, but enforcement is equally important to ensure that these building codes are followed. And the third point that was very clearly made was, this is a very complex issue that requires a lot of coordination. We're at the start of this mitigation journey. There are a lot of resources that are being diverted or provided here by the government. And there is a desire to expand as well as provide and fund different kinds of projects. And there's really scope for partnership between public and private sector to get the mitigation journey, probably the pace of mitigation journey even faster than, so that we can catch up and really protect lives as well as property. So thank you very much for joining me in this discussion, and hopefully we'll have follow-ups later. Thank you.